As preppers, we should understand that these power grid attacks are likely to continue and that there will be more of them in the future. But we should also be concerned about the fact that they can easily place the blame of some of these attacks on people like ourselves and use these attacks as a way to implement more controls over us as individuals. And this is what should really be concerning you right this second, especially surrounding the information that's currently being put out. And throughout the process of this conversation, I want you to keep in mind that people like us are not well liked by those who are in power because we don't necessarily need them. And I also want to give you some ideas and solutions for what to do if something like this were to happen in your area, like what just happened in Moore County, North Carolina. And if you're worried about preparing for a power outage due to a critical infrastructure attack in the future, then hit the subscribe button below because hopefully this information could help you and also give you some ideas as to what to expect down the road. Now, right now in Moore County, North Carolina, where this attack occurred, they're investigating two different possible motives for why this happened. And both of those motives are related to extremism. And in fact, the mainstream media has been reporting that over the last 2 years, there's been an uptick in online activity for extremist groups that are urging people to attack the critical infrastructure of the United States. And in fact, specifically attack the power grid. And they're even giving people instructions on how to effectively do it. Now, a federal memo was put out warning about attacks in the Pacific Northwest. And power companies in both Oregon and Washington have reported that they have experienced similar attacks to what happened in North Carolina at substations in their region. Now, the supposed motive for these attacks is violent anti-government criminal activity, right? Now, here's something I really want you to keep in mind and to pay attention to. We are considered extremists according to the FBI in many ways, and all of these types of attacks are being blamed on extremism. Understand that MVEs, militia violent extremists, are something that the FBI has recently labeled quite a few groups of people that would identify as preparedness-minded individuals, or AKA preppers. And there's even more information pushing that narrative that I'll share with you here in just a minute that you have to pay attention to, because you have to understand that not only could this be a way to blame people like ourselves for what's happening in the country right now, but you also have to understand that we could easily find ourselves in a situation where these types of activities are being used against us in order to maintain more control, aka implement gun control, implement a restriction on individual rights and access and everything else. So these are things we really need to be aware of, all right? So a report titled Mayhem, Murder, and Misdirection: Violent Extremist Attack Plots Against Critical Infrastructure in the USA 2016 through 2022 details quite a bit of information surrounding extremism and attacks on critical infrastructure within the United States, okay? It explains that US-based violent extremists have specific credible plans to attack critical infrastructure within the US. And this report actually reviews 94 cases of individuals charged with trying to attack critical infrastructure here in the United States between 2016 and 2022. Now, 35 of those attacks were specifically towards critical infrastructure, including the power grid. 19 of those were from Salafi jihadists, right? So we know that they're related to organized terror groups. And then 16 of those were related to white supremacy groups. Now, these white supremacist extremists are what are considered, obviously, domestic terrorism groups. Here's where things come into play, okay? We have to understand that because of this MVE labeling that's been placed on people like ourselves, been placed on Second Amendment supporters, if I could say Second Amendment properly, that would help a lot, and it's been placed on people who want to be self-reliant, sustain themselves, don't necessarily need the federal government, right? Well, throughout this report, it mentions quite a bit of information surrounding the idea of the fear of a tyrannical government being a big problem, right? And in this report, it says that the white supremacist extremist group's goals are to trigger societal collapse through something called accelerationism, which is basically pushing society to the edge through different styles of attacks, like things where you would take down the power grid in order to force society towards a collapse, which would then allow them to restructure things in a way they see more fit. But understand that accelerationism is what you should also be concerned about, because as preppers, a lot of people paint doomsday preppers and people who are worried about things like societal collapse as accelerationists, people who want these things to happen, people who want the end of the world to occur because they want to be able to quit their 9-to-5 and they want to finally rule the wasteland as a warlord, which is what they always should have been, right? They want to ignore the laws of the land and they don't want to worry about having to pay back their debts and everything else related to why people want this stuff to happen. Now, as a prepper, someone who identifies as a prepper, I do not want the end of the world to occur. I don't want SHTF to happen, and I definitely don't want to experience a societal collapse. Do I prepare for these things? Of course, because they're possibilities. And I guess if there's extremist groups here in the United States that are pushing these things to occur based on using infrastructure attacks and organizing in online forums and everything else, I can understand why I might need to prepare for those things a little bit better. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is that regardless of what I say I do or don't want, regardless of what I say I prepare for, people are going to label me as an extremist, which means I'm part of the problem when you start talking to the general population about these situations. And then you start combining the ideas that high-powered rifles are used to take out these substations, and that these extremist groups are pushing these types of attacks, and that their main goal is to prepare themselves against a tyrannical government with overreach that is no longer acceptable, while also breaking down society so that they can eventually restructure it in a more fitting manner according to their ideologies. And you have to start connecting the dots and realizing that they can easily label almost all of us under those terms if they would like to, and then use that against us in the sense of Second Amendment firearms rights and ownership, and our ability to operate as free individuals, especially when it comes to conversing online about some of the topics we talk about here in the preparedness community. So all of these things should give you red flags to really consider about what's happening here. Regardless of the validity of all these reports, if everything is 100% accurate to what it is they're putting out there, they can still use it against us no matter what. And if everything's not 100% accurate and not completely valid, then you really have to second guess the motive as to why these things are happening. But I wanted you to be prepared for this. Now, if this happens in your area, if you have a power grid attack in your area, or you're one of the residents in Moore County, North Carolina, right, where this just occurred, some of the things you can do to help yourself out. Obviously, getting like a portable power station is a good way to get through a temporary blackout scenario, because you can keep your electronics charged, which means you can keep communication going, which means you can basically have some quality of life still about you. You can also maybe maintain your security in the sense of your security systems, or even just being able to have the lights on if you need them, whatever it is. But you can also do yourself a favor and have some cash on hand, because as the residents of Moore County just experienced, having cash was sometimes the only way they were able to transact when they went to get additional gas, or when they went to get things that they required in the sense of groceries or whatever it was. Cash transactions were king at that time because nobody had internet or they didn't have power at all. So these are things that you need to consider now, because these attacks are going to keep happening. But I'm also worried about the aftermath of these attacks. And I don't just mean not having power, because we're prepared, right? As preppers, I have ways to maintain my level of power, I have ways to protect myself, and I have ways to get around some of those issues. But I don't necessarily have ways of shielding myself from the federal government deciding that I'm actually part of the problem. And I don't necessarily have ways of convincing people in the general population that I don't want these things to happen, I'm not urging these things to occur, and I don't want to be part of any of this extremist activity. And yet, I'm easily labeled a militia violent extremist regardless of what I say, because the FBI says people like anyone involved with the American Contingency Group could easily be considered under that umbrella. So I wanted to bring this conversation to the forefront and give you something to think about. I'll share a link to this report that I referenced, the Mayhem, Murder, and Misdirection report, so that way you can read it yourself, because there's a lot of information in there that I didn't necessarily feel I wanted to share in this video, but would be worth your time to read to understand exactly why these concerns are coming to the surface. And if you need anything else from me at all, you can leave a comment below or go to magicprepper.com. Without anything else to say about this situation, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.